In the last section, we discussed how the list view works, and we're now going to use list view inside of our application. I think you'll generally be happy with the amount of work that it takes to create this list view. We get pretty good bang for our buck as far as the amount of effort we have to put in and the benefit that our application receives on the performance side of things. So we're going to implement the whole list view inside of our library list component. Obviously, library list, it is meant to show a list of data. To start, we'll first import the list view component from the React Native library. So at the top, we will import list view from React Native. Next, we need to tell the list view which list of items it will be using to construct itself, like what data it should be using. And we need to pass in our list of libraries to it. So we only have to set up this kind of list of data for the component exactly one time, like immediately when the component first starts up, right? Immediately when our library list first starts up. So we will place the logic to create this list view inside of a lifecycle method called component will mount. That way, the instant that the component is about to render, we can tell list view where to get its data from. So inside of our component, we will implement component will mount. Remember, component will mount is a lifecycle method. All we have to do is define it. And just by defining it, the instant that our component is about to be rendered to the device of the screen, any code that we place inside of here will be automatically called. Okay, so inside of here, we are going to create our list view and tell it what data it should use inside the list. Don't read too much into the code that we're about to write here. It's a little bit boilerplate setup for making this list, and you can easily copy paste this setup from list view to list view. So we're not going to dive too deep on the code here because it's really just some boilerplate setup. So I'm going to say const ds, that's just an awful name, I know, equals new list view dot data source. And then we are going to pass in an object with a property. Let's do this on a new line. Row has changed. And as a value, I'm going to pass a fat arrow function. And this is the part where I'm saying, don't read into this too much. Don't worry about the logic too much. I'm going to say R1, R2, R1 does not equal R2, like so. So again, when we create the list view, we have to tell it exactly what source of data to use. So this list view.data source right here is a very fancy little object, tons of methods attached to it that we never really have to deal with at all. And it knows all about how to figure out what items to show on the screen depending on where the user has scrolled to inside the list. So then the last thing we have to do is you'll notice that we haven't actually told it what data to use just yet. So we will feed in some amount of data by saying this.data source equals ds.clone with rows. Sorry about that. Clone with rows, this.props.libraries. Okay, so now this is the real meat of everything here. We have this data source object, and we're telling it, take this list of libraries, so this.props.libraries, and you are going to use this list of libraries to render a list of data to the screen, or to have something to just render the screen. That's all. Remember that we only have access to this.props.libraries because we already hooked up that map state to props function. Okay, so this is our data source for the list view. The last thing that we have to do is actually create the list view component and then give it this data to display. So inside of my render method, we're going to finally get a return statement in here. So I'm going to add in some parens because I expect this to be a multi-line statement. And I will create a list view with a data source of this.data source. And then I'll close the tag off. Okay, so we have now created a list view, and we've given it the data source to use to get to knowledge of all the items that it needs to show on the screen. There's one last item that we have to do in here, and this one's a little bit of maybe unexpected. Maybe I claimed that this was going to be easier than it actually was going to be. The last thing we have to do is we have to instruct the list view on how to render a single row inside of our application. So you'll notice that at this point in time, we have done absolutely nothing to instruct the list view on how to render a single row or like a single library, right? Like the list view is not going to just magically look at our list of libraries and say, oh, it has a title property, I guess I'll show the title, right? It does not do that. We have to tell the list view how to render a very specific row. To do so, we will add on a prop called render row. And then we will pass this a function reference. So let's say this.render row. And now I'm going to define a helper method called render row, like so. So now our job is to add some amount of logic to render row right here that is going to figure out how to just render a single element inside of our list. So render row right here needs to return a single library. That's our job. Let's take a quick break and then continue on implementing this render row function.